Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. It's good to have everybody joining us for the first time. If this is your first session with us or joining again, this is the Sky School's Crisis to Transformation series for educators, really a conversation for educators. And our focus is on taking this really challenging moment that we're all in and seeing how we can make some lemonade. How can we take this opportunity to reboot ourselves, to gain some skills, to gain some inspiration, to gain some tools, and to sit and reflect and listen to some amazing visionaries and educators who have some ideas about how we can really make some fundamental shifts in the way we work with our young people, the way we serve our communities. And we know there are so many changes that are really needed at this time. So thank you for taking the moment. My name is Ilan. I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Rondi. Rondi, can you wave? And, we'll be your host for the evening, but we're not going to do much talking. We're happy to answer questions and we'll help facilitate. But we have a very special guest who's going to really give us our experience this evening, who we'll introduce in a moment. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a little moment and check in with everyone and see how folks are doing. How are you feeling? What's on your mind? What brought you here? Anything you'd like to share about what's going on for you as an educator in this moment? There's a lot happening in our world right now. So many layers. So you could share directly if you'd like to speak out, or you could drop it in the chat. Let's just take a few moments and yeah, check in. Let us know what's going on for you. What challenges are you facing right now, or what are you discovering in this moment?
About addictions, I see more addictions increase now because the people are sitting inside, not exposing to the main public. I just had a full moon meditation, and the one guy smoking in the event. So I taught him how to do the straw meditation, straw breathing. He liked it. So yeah, I personally, I feel there is a much greater need than ever before these programs.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, there's been a huge increase in addiction, and so challenging for people not to have access to other releases and support right now. Anything else?
I want to share. The current political climate is pretty disturbing for me, how the country is being divided based on ideologies and race and at every level. And I saw this and I thought, this is where we start, right, with our children. And I want to be, do the best I can be by learning and dropping whatever biases I might have unknowingly. So this is awesome opportunity for me personally. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can share. I'm calling in from the Bay Area. We unfortunately have some bad smoke again today. So showed up last night, and so kind of really affects you. your mood, your health, your kind of, I feel like I have this low grade headache that doesn't go away, I work a lot with young people, mostly high school age, and young adults. So it's a lot, to be doing online school and to have these, just the kind of visceral reaction you have when you can't even leave your home, you know, and because you can't even breathe really well outside. So it's tough, but looking forward to this conversation. It's always so great to just get new ideas, and grateful I learned about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam. Thank you for sharing. It is a lot. Yeah. Any last person want to share what's going on for you, or what brought you here this evening?
I'll just say that the kind of in line with thoughts about the political climate and division, just everything that's been going on in the country, and more specifically here in New York City, and then right outside my window, just since specifically Memorial Day in June, and George Floyd is hitting me pretty hard, and because it's hitting the communities I serve really hard, and the children, and particularly being separated from them for several months, and not being able to be a physical presence and a source of love and comfort was tough. So even having a conversation like this, which is pretty brief, 20, 25 minutes, maybe to share a few ideas, is usually a source of stress for me, because it's like, it's all I do day in and day out, and I want to deliver something succinct and effective. So usually I just say, what would Elon do? And it calms me down, and I just I let it be. And so hopefully we'll get something out of this conversation. But those are also some of the challenges I'm experiencing.
Beautiful.
Can I speak?
Yeah, you can close us out, and then we'll jump in.
I work at a state college, and I'm considered staff. Right now we're doing race relations as far as students, college students, with staff and the college as a whole. We're having a book review as far as racial equality, as far as former students coming back to speak to the college as to introduce more of the community, and how it relates to speaking to younger children to get them into the fields of ophthalmology. So I joined this Zoom class, this Zoom, to further my interest in creating lines of communication between different races, and to find it interesting. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Miss Wade.
Thank you.
And Poonam, by all means, take care of your head, whatever you need to do. We hope you're all comfortable. So thank you for joining us. It is my distinct pleasure to stop talking and introduce our host for the evening, who you already got a taste of his heart and his sincerity. We have Hemant Venkataraman, also known as Mr. V around New York, one of the people I often look to for guidance and modeling, an amazing educator, friend, brother, a founder of a charter school in Brooklyn, and now the founder of Schools Culture Solutions after being a long-time career educator, really looking at how can we create communities and cultures that serve everyone. And I've for so many years admired the way he works with everybody in his community, from parents, teachers, his peers, and specifically above and beyond with students. So he's been a real guide for me, for everybody in the Sky Schools team. He's been helping us to really level up our skills and become more effective, more restorative, more present to the needs of our students and our communities. So a real pleasure. Thank you for taking the time, Hemant, and let's all turn off our volume and give our attention.
Thanks so much, Elon. I'll just share my screen here. All right. Yeah, so I won't introduce myself much further than that. Thank you for the warm introduction, Elon. So in terms of today's agenda, oh, let me go in here. All right, so the agenda today is truth and healing. That's it. I'm gonna keep it real simple. I'm not gonna overcomplicate it. In all seriousness, you know, as an educator, I don't sugarcoat history. Certainly not when we're talking about systemic racism. And that's a truth part of today's conversation. But I'm also a career educator, a teacher. I'm a Sky Schools teacher, a meditation teacher, a restorative justice teacher, a parent. I'm a healer, and healing is really important to me. It's a big part of what I do and what I believe in my educational philosophy. So we'll certainly talk about healing as well. But I do ask everyone to keep an open mind to the quote unquote, the truth segment of tonight's conversation first. And to come open, come willing to learn, to grow, perhaps to challenge existing beliefs. And then maybe we grow together and have a conversation and incorporate some ideas from this evening. So I'm going to just throw a couple of rapid fire questions out there. I know this isn't, you know, interactive, but just for you to contemplate, you know, what are the first few words, thoughts, phrases that come to mind when you see these questions? What are your core beliefs as an educator? Is our country divided? And if so, how so? What are the first few thoughts that rush to mind?
Media.
I'm just gonna fire them out. I know it's not, though I appreciate the participation. I understand we have about kind of 20 to 25 minutes to maybe share some ideas and then do Q&A. And I'd love to, I guess, to be interactive at that point. Why are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students far less likely to graduate high school and go to college than their white classmates? Why are 1/3 of Black men in the United States currently incarcerated or in some phase of the criminal justice system? Why do Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students have lower standardized test scores on average than white and Asian students? Why are Black students suspended more often than other students? And when they are, why are they suspended for longer durations for the same exact infractions as students of other racial and ethnic identities? Why are Black Americans so disproportionately affected by police shootings? What does the term racism even mean? As you formulate a definition in your mind, what is that definition? So consider the following. We just saw a bunch of stats, open-ended questions about disparities and disproportionality. Why do they exist? There's kind of two possibilities, right? Either there are inherent differences in the races, and that's what leads to these disparities and disproportionalities in criminal justice system and education and everywhere else. Or all races are inherently equal, and therefore these disparities are the result of human actions, perhaps unjust, unfair, inequitable actions on the part of people. So I just wanted to start there and establish a foundation. What does the term racism even mean? Well, if we believe the latter, if we believe that the thoughts, actions, and bodies of one race are inherently superior to the thoughts, actions, bodies of another race, then that is the definition of racism. It doesn't even have to mean there's hatred, just a belief of superiority. When that racism is embedded in the design and implementation of institutions, just permeates everything, is pervasive, and just becomes normal behavior and practice. That's what we mean by systemic racism. And specifically, and as it pertains to the history of our country, white supremacy is a term that means the same definition as above, but the ideology that holds that the thoughts, actions, and bodies of white people specifically are inherently superior to the thoughts, actions, and bodies of non-white people, which has governed the history of every system, structure, and institution of our country, and something that we need to touch upon this evening before we can talk anything about what it means to be anti-racist, right? So the term anti-racist was popularized by scholar Ibram X. Kendi, especially this year, as a lot of people picked up his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was published last year, right? And so Dr. Kendi submits that either we're racist or we're anti-racist. Either we're racist as per the definition on the screen, or we're actively anti-racist. We are actively taking upon thoughts and actions that demonstrate the equality of all races. But there's no in between. There's no, well, I'm not racist. Well, I don't see color. Well, I'm colorblind. Such a thing doesn't exist. Either you're actively, proactively doing these things, or you are somehow harboring racist thought or contributing to racist action. Now, often when I'm discussing systemic racism with educators, with friends, with colleagues, the phrase systemic racism itself often alienates people. This is sometimes where I lose people and sometimes my white colleagues and white audience. People say to me, look, I get that the original white settlers of this country did some horrible things to the indigenous people who were already here. I get that at one time there used to be slavery in this country, but like, why are we still talking about that? I mean, it's over. So like, get over it. Why are you still talking about this? Look, I grew up in suburban New Jersey, about 30 miles from my current home in Brooklyn. History class for me growing up, elementary school, middle school, and even high school was, look, some bad stuff happened in this country. Then the great President Lincoln saved the day. It still needed some improvement. So 100 years later, a wonderful guy named Martin Luther King came along and he finished the job. He made everything equal. Many of you probably had a similar experience in your education. So if that's our upbringing, if that's what we believe to be the true history of our country, we're shocked when an unarmed person can be murdered by police, not even suspected of a crime, as young as 12 years old, and no action is taken whatsoever. What I submit to all of you this evening is to be shocked when things like this occurs, to be completely oblivious to American history. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. So let's make a couple of things clear, especially to those who feel that unease, that discomfort when we use terms like white supremacy. To my white colleagues, we're going to look at some examples now of the emergence of systemic racism in the form of white supremacy. It doesn't mean it's your fault as an individual, but it is historical fact in the United States. It's also historical facts that genocides have been committed by human beings of all different races and ethnicities across the globe, perpetrated against human beings of all different races and ethnicities. So when we're learning about the devastating impact of white supremacy in America, please don't misconstrue that conversation to imply that the white race is somehow inherently evil or inferior or to blame for everything. Not at all. That would just fit the definition of racism that's on the screen right now. But yes, the history of the United States is a white supremacist history that continues to have a destructive impact to this day. And we can't change that impact if we don't understand the history, hence the word truth in the title of today's conversation. Again, to white educators, nothing we're talking about is an indication that you cannot effectively teach, for example, Black students or students of color, or that you cannot be an anti-racist educator. You most certainly can. Some of the greatest teachers and the teachers I respect most throughout my career are white. But the first step is getting a full picture of the truth, and then we'll talk about next steps. Earlier this summer, I attended a really thought-provoking class. It's probably stayed with me on a daily basis, taught by Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And it was based on a lot of ideas in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness. I highly, highly recommend it for everybody, but especially educators. And he was recently re-released with a new preface, all right? And so this class was specifically on the history of policing in the United States. And I hope you'll trust in a few minutes, you'll see the connection, and we'll draw connections to education and why it is critical to understand these facts and these teachings before we can be anti-racist teachers, educators, whatever we teach, math, social studies, or meditation. So the first question we answered was, well, what was the first police in America? Before we had precincts and commanders in chief and commissioners or anything, even before we had uniforms, what were the first police? The first form of police we ever had in this country were known as slave patrols. Before 1865, before the 13th Amendment, when slavery was the norm and was legal and constitutional in this country, groups of white people in different districts in different states were actually charged with ensuring that other whites were safe from slave rebellions or just any bodily harm that black slaves may inflict. So they took an oath to apprehend runaways or just generally to ride around terrorizing slaves so that they would be scared and they would never revolt, right? To police and discipline slaves. In fact, in many regions, you see an example of an oath on the screen. Participation in slave patrols was mandatory, right? You could actually be charged. You could be held criminally responsible if you refused to be part of a slave patrol. So it's important to understand that from the very earliest days of policing in the United States, white American civilians were given the responsibility, the obligation to police and regulate black bodies as they saw fit for their benefit with absolutely no limit or regulation. Does that sound familiar at all in modern day? When a young black man is murdered, not by police, but even by a fellow civilian in his neighborhood, and we're saddened and we're shocked and we're desperately seeking justice, and the message that we receive is indignance. We're actually met with, how dare you question the actions and motivations of this white adult killer of this young man? We start to see, well, where were the origins of this thinking 200 plus years ago? So then what happened? Well, then the Civil War took place and the 13th Amendment was passed, banning slavery and involuntary servitude in our country. Did that change everything? If you're like me, when you were in 7th grade, you were led to believe, yes, it did. That was it. We had Lincoln, he freed the slaves. What's left to complain about? When you were in 10th grade and took AP history, even in an advanced placement college preparatory class, you were taught problem solved. No, not whatsoever. Because after the Civil War, folks had to find a workaround. By this time, we have a well-established white supremacist society. So they're gonna find workarounds. So what's the first workaround? Something known as black codes. I wonder if everyone is aware, yes, slavery was declared unconstitutional, but did you know that once you're convicted of a crime in this country, involuntary servitude is actually constitutional? Essentially, you can be a slave if you are a prisoner in this country. So black codes. If you don't provide, if you're just walking on the street and I ask you for evidence of employment and you don't have it, you can be returned to involuntary servitude. We'll create a tax. If you don't provide a $100 tax per year, then we pass a law. Well, then you have to be a farmer, right? You can just arbitrarily stop someone until they commit a crime that you deem a crime. Harass them until they say something rude or make a face or walk away, and then physically resist. Boom, crime, involuntary servitude. In fact, you can be placed right back on the plantation with the same master that you once served. Does that sound familiar in present day? Well, he was resisting. Well, I was just going to ask her some questions, but then she said this, so I arrested her. That's happening present day. And so I'm going to ask over and over and over to educators, to friends, to colleagues, to whoever, has anything really changed? And I'm going to tell you, as far as all the evidence I can see, no, it definitely hasn't. Well, black codes were challenged, no problem. We'll pass something new known as Jim Crow laws. They achieve basically the same thing, and they last for another 100 years until 1964, when finally the Civil Rights Act banned the Jim Crow laws. So now we hear in present day, the same policing, the same story. Well, but he's a bad guy. He was selling cigarettes illegally. Well, he's a thug. Well, Jacob Blake, he's a bad guy. Maybe he is, but you don't get to publicly execute him without a trial, do you? Because that's called lynching. We had 6,000 of those at the hands of the victimization of black people in this country, with the public watching and often celebrating. It's not supposed to be happening anymore. So what's the connection to education, since generally those of us on this call identify as educators? Well, I would again ask the educators on this conversation, why would we, if this is the history of our country, steeped in brutality against Black Americans and then against BIPOC people in general, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, why would we even have a shred of expectation of equality, of equity, or justice in our schools, in the education? Why would we expect that, right? If this is our history, white supremacy and the regulation of Black bodies, movement, and freedom, why would we think our schools are somehow houses of equality and justice, right? Was there some turning point? It sure wasn't the 13th Amendment, wasn't the Civil War, wasn't the Civil Rights Movement. What was the turning point that would lead us to believe that this would be the case? And if we understand that it's not the case, then we can start to fight against the oppression and injustice that's happening in our schools as we speak today, right? So we had Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which actually said segregation is constitutional. We had Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which said segregation is unconstitutional, but followed by severe backlash. That's not the turning point we were looking for, because people actually just openly defied the rule, or there was white flight from cities so that they could get away from schools that had people of color in them. And then the real estate and the banks and all of those institutions got involved. Redlining made it impossible for Black people to buy houses in those same neighborhoods. Well, there's our segregation. We can find a way to make it legal again, right? And I want to bring it all the way to the present, right? Because this is something I study. I'm a restorative justice practitioner, which means zero tolerance is antithetical to everything I do, right? I presented stats earlier that show the disproportionate suspension of Black, of Hispanic, of students compared to their white peers. Understand the history. We've always had disproportionate suspensions in our country, but specifically they took off when under the Clinton administration, zero tolerance rules were placed in the Gun-Free School Act of 1994. The goal of this was to say we cannot have guns in schools. Zero tolerance. If that happens, kick a kid out. Kick them to the curb. Don't let them ever be around again. Now, how did that exacerbate disproportionality and suspensions? Because then school leaders expanded this to say, well, maybe not just guns, maybe any kind of weapon. Then they expanded to, well, maybe what I perceive as a weapon. And you can already kind of see where that's going to go when it becomes subjective. Then it became willy-nilly. It became anything I want. How do I know this? Because I make sure to study primary sources, which is something I'm going to comment on in a moment. For example, here in New York City, the present day discipline code as it stands today, if you look on the top left, if a student is removed from a classroom 4 times, they have to face at least 1 day of suspension. Why do I make a big deal of suspension in a conversation about anti-racism? Because the American Psychological Association has made very clear that suspension is extremely detrimental to students, psychologically correlated with higher suicide rates, drug and alcohol abuse, alienation from school. And when you don't think school is for you, that's how we promote the school to prison pipeline. So if you're removed from class, well, what can you get removed for? Not wearing your uniform, making noise, rude. Who gets to determine what's rude? And who do you think gets labeled rude most often in our schools today? Clothing, headgear, policing Black bodies. It's in our school discipline code of conduct in the largest, most segregated school district in the country. I don't know if you know that, but New York City is currently more segregated than it was in 1954. So how's that for have things changed at all, right? So when we say systemic, we're talking about every institution of this country, education, policing, real estate, even the medical industry, not exempt. My wife is a physician and she's learning, and we're learning together about the history of atrocities in her industry, right? Look, even Serena Williams, the most legendary women's tennis player ever, one of the wealthiest women in the world, not exempt to racism. Did you know she almost died after giving birth to her daughter? Why? Because doctors didn't believe her level of pain. Why? Because historically, we don't believe Black women when they report their level of pain, and they're 3 times more likely to die giving birth. So this is everywhere, and that's what we mean when we say systemic. So what does healing look like? Step 1, engage with history. Engage with the painful truth. Yes, I put painful immediately on the slide because it is painful to talk about this stuff, no matter who you are and what your background. But we have to. Right? We have to examine our own biases. We've got to learn about our own identity and really be honest about the biases, the privilege that we hold, and the lenses that we're using when we interact with students, no matter who our students are socioeconomically, racially, ethnically. And we've also got to use, again, I'm going to use the term primary sources. We've got to learn the truth about the history of our country if we're going to understand how it connects to present and what we're going to do about it. That could mean reading some of these books that I've talked about here, a couple that I didn't yet mention. I'll put my email address up at the end because I didn't aggregate these into one source, but I'm happy to share resources with folks after the fact. Directly, if you email me or share with Elon, I have so many more resources that we could possibly discuss this evening. Books, podcasts, links, articles, right? And engaging in primary sources. In fact, some amazing organizations right now, just yesterday, I got these primary sources from an event hosted by the New York Historical Society, Facing History in Ourselves, the organization, and the Schomburg Institute, right? So when someone tells me, oh, it's not that bad, oh, this is fake news, you're making it up. Well, I can show them this article on the left. Donovan was the superintendent in 1968 in New York City, the first guy to say, we need police to guard schools. Look at the phrasing by the so-called progressive liberal New York Times in this article. We're guarding our schools. From whom? And who exactly are we guarding inside our schools? Whose safety are we preoccupied with? The community, this was in response to an attack on a staff member. And the community pleaded with the city, the union, whoever would listen, and said, we don't condone the violence, but nobody's listening to us. Like, what do you expect us to do at some point when our communities have no resources, no one hears us, we're left behind, and all the superintendent can say is more police, more law and order. That might ring a bell because we're hearing it from the top today, right? So when people tell you fake news, you can find primary sources. When Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad told us about a young man named Eugene Williams, 17 years old, who was swimming in Lake Michigan in Chicago in 1964, and accidentally waded a few feet over to the so-called white side of the lake and was stoned to death, a 17-year-old boy stoned to death. And when the police showed up and people pointed to the perpetrators who were hanging out there as if nothing had happened, and the police did nothing and actually started arresting the people complaining, you can show them primary sources, which I just got by Googling and researching and finding everything from a photo to witness statements to, sadly, the young man's death certificate and report. And so you can report these things using primary sources. So I keep using that term because we have to counteract the phrase fake news. It is so easy for somebody to say, oh, that's fake news. No, because I'm going to show you primary sources of these incidents. Step 2, restorative practices. Well, this is a massive conversation, not one that I can obviously delve into in depth. But restorative practices prioritize relationships, community, and connection. Restorative practices make relationships the foundation of everything we do for a few reasons. Number one, connection has now been expressed by scientists as a mental health need. We need to feel strong social connections with other human beings. So when people used phrases like COVID separation at the start of quarantine, that's a real thing. That's not made up. Students' mental health was literally at risk because we cut them off from their sense of community, safety, stability, sometimes even shelter and food, right? Restorative practices says if you first focus, even before content, before anything, on building a strong community, using techniques like classroom community building circles and others, then when conflict and harm inevitably do happen, it'll be much easier to resolve them and repair that harm. But guess what? Human psychology is as such. I don't bring harm to my own home. I don't harm a place that I consider where I feel like I belong and people belong to me and we have each other's back. But on the rare occasion that it does happen, we can repair it using things besides suspension and expulsion and things that exacerbate the school to prison pipeline, right? So that's why this is an anti-racist practice, because with restorative practices, we start to diminish. And as a school leader, I was able to nearly eradicate suspension, right? So when I say we have to examine our own biases, I have to be honest and say, as a school leader, even when I think of as recently as 2014, 15, I suspended kids for reasons that I cringe about now, right? And I know that I did things that I would now consider racist policy. So I'm not here pointing fingers saying, you guys got to look at your, I have to look at my own as well. And I know that I've done racist things in the past. And I have to contend with that, grow, and be better now. And restorative practices is how we nearly eradicated suspension and how we sent nearly 100% of our students to college this past June, at least a dozen who would have been expelled at any other school. So people know that my motto is connection is the curriculum, not part of the curriculum, not squeeze it in if you can. Make this your hashtag if you can a couple of times tonight and next week. But this is the motto, folks. Connection is the curriculum. It's restorative practices. It's an anti-racist practice. Third, prioritize self-care. Well, most of the folks on this conversation know this because Sky Schools is all about self-care for educators, students, and family members, right? We need to know the impact of trauma and stress on the developing brain, on youth. But in my case, why do I bring this up in an anti-racist conversation? Because if community building helps schools be anti-racist, then we know that stress creates social disconnect. So what prevents us from having community and relationship with others? Stress and trauma. But we can counteract that stress and trauma. We can improve social connectedness, right? And then we can be anti-racist schools if we do these practices in the classroom. So to an extent, I'm preaching to the choir on this one. But I tell every teacher, there's free apps out there. There's free websites, YouTube channels. Even if you did 1 minute of mindfulness as a break, 1 minute of meditation, 1 minute to help students realize we can calm, we can quiet our minds before we move on. We would actually be contributing to an anti-racist environment in doing so by allowing them to connect better with those around them. And my last step is make life the curriculum. What do I mean by that? I want to share a quote with you by Ashley McCall, a third grade teacher in Chicago. When we structure students' learning around their lived experiences and present needs, they not only develop content knowledge and skills, but they grow to care about and for one another. So what does that look like? Look, even specifically, I'm working with teachers now all over the region. You're a math teacher. It's not enough just for us to study the history of the United States. Study it with your students. But even that's not enough. This fourth step is go beyond studying the truth and systemic racism. Make your students' lives the curriculum. If your students, if front and center for them right now is COVID-19 stimulus checks, study their distribution in math class. In science class, inquire about virus transmission. I worked with a basketball coach who does an after-school program the other day. We did a circle at the end of practice, and we talked about kneeling and the NBA playoff boycott that had happened that week. I worked with a cooking teacher the other day in an after-school program, but we had a circle and we talked about food insecurity in our community and in others. This could be done even in a community of great economic privilege to develop empathy, and that itself is an anti-racist practice. So I'll pause there and make an attempt at some answers to questions perhaps, but I'll also leave my contact info on the screen. I hope that made some sense. That felt really, really fast to me. I'm kind of quickly just scratching the surface on some really important issues, but I'll pause there and look out for some questions or comments.
Hi. I don't know if you hear me.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I'm an educator. Matter of fact, I know Elan too, Durandi, and they have been tremendous blessings to me personally and to my school district. In addition to being a course teacher, which I totally agree with every single thing that you have said, I also have a degree in ethnic studies. So a lot of the things that you said, truly you are preaching to the choir within me. So I really applaud what you're doing, and I really appreciate that we're finally having this very painful and uncomfortable conversation. And I really want to applaud you for doing this. It's a fantastic job.
Thank you. I tried to throw enough controversial things out there that somebody will argue with me or push back or yell at me. So please feel free. This is a safe space for debate as well.
Could we get the slides in the email or the proprietary?
No, I can share these for sure. Yeah.
Thank
I mean, feel free to email me directly,
Okay.
and I can share them. And if Elan proposes anything else, I'll share with him. And but anyone who wants to email me, because there's so many more resources we can talk about. Maybe you teach a particular subject, maybe you work in a specific community. So we're just starting a conversation today. So I'm really happy to exchange resources or anything else, ideas with anyone. So please feel free to connect with me at Mr. V at School Culture Solutions.
Hemant, would you be so kind to drop the contact in the chat, and then maybe we could drop the screen share and we could see each other?
Yeah, let me do that.
Beautiful.
Where's the chat? Yes.
Yeah, any questions? First of all, just thank you so much. I know there was so much content in a little time, and you were masterful. But it's really so critical and so absolutely fundamental that we're all able to look at it right now. So thank you for the broad breadth you gave us in a quick time. Any questions? Coming up for folks.
I have a quick question. So I don't know, my question at the beginning was going to be I run into people that are so disheartened, and yet in what, 20 minutes, you've literally turned this around, like by identifying the problem, looking at what's happened, and giving concrete steps, very clearly concrete steps. But how do you do it? I mean, this is like amazing how quickly my opinion changed, but I'm just wondering, how would you deal with people that are much deeper into resignation?
I had a couple of those experiences lately, and so I had to race through them, but I was working with a staff recently and talking to the principal, and I got this idea because he shared with me, look, the staff is going to be resistant. They also have a soured kind of impression of restorative practices and just that term, and like kids need punishment and all that stuff. So you're up against a lot. So, but he wanted me to really help them appreciate just these contexts that we were talking about today. But then I learned that, interestingly, about 4 of the staff members were from a region of Eastern Europe, just, plagued by war, by genocide, by a lot of serious things, and their families were directly affected. And so I ran a circle, and we talked about, is there anyone in this room, because we're white, we're black, we're indigenous, we're Latino, there's a lot of different identities in the room, but is there anyone in this room whose ancestors or whoever it is that first came to this country didn't come or who didn't identify with struggle in some way? What was interesting was that, well, everyone identified with struggle in some way, and incredible rich stories came out. And so when one teacher's grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, when another's endured things in Japan, when another's was from Eastern Europe, and a lot of them identify with that. And then, of course, Black American teachers talking about what's happening to them day to day right here in Brooklyn. But everyone was like, okay, struggle is this kind of universal human thing, but I feel a little bit more open to now looking at, but what's been the specific struggle in this young country? What's happened here in the last 200 years? Okay, so you're not saying I'm the bad guy, but yes, this is a fact. This is a white supremacist nation. You can't run from it. There is data. Let's look at primary sources. And so I found that there are tactics to open folks' minds, and there were different ones. I'm going to a school next week or in 2 weeks where the principal's like, here's what you're up against. 5 or 6 of my staff members are married to police in the town, post things on Facebook that are anti-Black Lives Matter. Can you handle that? And I'm like, I mean, I'm not going to wave a magic wand, make everything okay, but I think that I can create a conversation where we can all connect, and then let's see what comes of it. And then that's why I keep using the term primary sources. I'm not going to do anything that's hearsay. I'm not just going to, guess what? Everything's racist and leave it there. I'm going to put an article in your face. It might be painful. I'm going to put the picture of a 17-year-old child who was stoned to death because we have to confront our history using the actual primary sources. And I don't know, now I'm rambling, but I think that's been the strategy. We find commonality, we identify around struggle, but then we also don't dismiss the unique struggle of particularly Black people in America, because that's the struggle here. So let's now look at what's going on here, but it doesn't dismiss you as a person or your ancestors. And it's kind of worked so far.
Great, thanks.
I have a question. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hemant, for all of that information. I just wanted to know, how do you balance, it's COVID times and people are feeling really stressed out from COVID, and yet it feels like if we didn't have COVID and we didn't have this pause button, we wouldn't be having this conversation about racial equity. So it feels like we can't wait
Right.
to, you know, just say, hey, there's a better time, because we need to have these conversations now. But I'm finding that people are so stressed, and I don't, how do you strike that balance, you know, of handling that?
And I'm certainly not the expert, but one, what you're saying resonates with me, because exactly what you described has been my experience over the past few months. So starting late spring, summer, principals who never before wanted to waste their time, restorative, this, circle that, were calling me like, aren't you like kind of an equity or diversity guy? Like, I guess, okay, let's talk. And they'd say, well, you know, I got to do that, I got to do this, but also like, I don't even know how the heck my school is going to look in the fall and all that. So I said, well, restorative practices is kind of an umbrella that can achieve all of this, right? Because number one, students, staff, everybody is hurting right now and in desperate need of connection and healing. And let's use restorative practices to achieve that, specifically circle practices. And let me show you how you can even do circles effectively, like on Zoom. Like, let's make that our priority. Just connection, stories. Like, I even have curricula, like first 10 days of school, don't you dare do a fraction or make your kids write an essay. Connection, 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 right? And I gave sample lesson plans, and I got to share some stuff with you guys. Like, Facing History has some tremendous stuff. Morningside Center, if you're not a New Yorker, is like a top organization for curricula and restorative stuff. So I'll share it, or Ilan, let's find a way to coordinate, because I definitely want everyone here tonight to see that stuff, because it's tremendous. So then, centering it around connection, and even for staff, it just started to open the door for that, right? Because then even staff would say, all right, well, I feel, you know, like, how am I going to now broach these topics with kids in my classroom? I know that's what they're thinking about. I know it's their lived experience. We will continue. I'd say, well, here's how you're going to do it in circles, and here's lesson plans for it. And they were more open to it. So I hope that sort of addresses kind of what you were saying, but it happened organically in that way. And just to punch that point again, it was based on the subject of restorative practices, and specifically circles in the classroom was the entry point to get into all of these things.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Maybe one more question.
Means, is there some kind of a portal or something we have when you say that primary source of information? Because I always have argument with my daughters also. They are all 3 teens. Whenever I say something, show me something. They will ask.
Well, I'm glad they're saying that. I'm glad they're holding you accountable. Yeah. So one of my favorites is this organization, Facing History and Ourselves. So if you Google it, you'll see they're tremendous, right? But I have some specific links for you guys. Let me see if I'll just paste them in the chat. I have 3 links that you can start with.
Okay.
But there's so much more. There's so much more. So, you know, email me or, you know, I'm sure Ilan and I can coordinate and we'll figure out a way. But I'm going to paste a couple links just for you guys to munch on right now. That exactly, Ravi, get to that. Like, primary source versus, I heard this in a tabloid. I heard this kind of third hand through the pundit on CNN tonight, but there was no evidence. We got to stress that. And yeah, so great question. Let me paste a couple links right now as you guys prepare to kind of wrap up.
Yeah, especially we are in Southeast, predominant, a lot of, you can see that resistance here in South, especially North Carolina and South Carolina.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you.
Cool. And I also want to, I think you got the idea, but if you're interested in having the experience with circles, if you're not familiar with restorative circles, that environment, Hemant is an incredible facilitator and trainer, and would be happy to work with your organization to help you have an experience and understand how you yourself can be a vehicle to bring that to your school with his support or other support. So I really encourage folks, if you're not in a school that is embracing restorative practice at this time, and you're looking for an inroad to do this work, I encourage it highly. Great. So Hemant shared some links. Thank you all. If you have any burning questions, please shoot them to him privately or follow up, and we will also follow up and send some resources out to everybody who registered for this session. We want to hit the self-care as we do this work. There can be heaviness, right? It's a reality of sitting with the pain, as he said, of the truth that we have to look at in this country and what's happening in our schools, in our communities, for our brothers, our sisters, our family as a whole. And it's our problem collectively. And to take responsibility takes energy. So Rondi, would you be so kind as to give us a soft landing and help us reset a bit? Dear Rondi?
Okay, yes. For those who don't have their cameras on, it'd be great if I could see you. And everyone, let's just sit up straight. I know you spotlighted me, but I like to see you, so I can switch it for myself. Okay. So let's sit up straight and let's just roll our shoulders backwards. And don't forget to breathe. Drop your chin. You could rub the back of your neck a little bit and your shoulders. Shake out your arms. You don't really need them. Raise up your arms real high. Just feel your spine straight. Put one arm up and look at the palm, and then the other side. And then bring your hands down so they're just on the top of your head. Just kind of rub your head a little bit. You could tap your head if you want. Between your thumb and forefinger, just outline your eyebrows. Very gently go over your eyelids. Trace your tear ducts. And put your knuckle in your jaw joints. Good pull on your earlobes. Grab your whole ears and take them for a little bicycle ride forward and back. Good. And now let's just close our eyes and take a deep breath in. And just put your hand on your belly and just take a few deep breaths. Feeling the rise and fall. And now very gently, you can just touch your eyes. And just feel grateful for all that you're able to see. The beauty as well as the sadness. And you can touch your nose, take a deep breath in, and just be grateful for the filter, that your nose is a filter to keep you healthy. And you can smell beautiful flowers and food, and also things that maybe don't smell so great. And you could put your fingers on your mouth. Through our mouth, we get to speak and taste and speak. Let's be grateful for our senses of sight and smell and speech. Let's touch our ears. Be grateful for all the noises we hear, all the music we hear, the sounds of our loved ones speaking to us, babies crying and laughing. And then just put your hands in your lap your hands together, and let's be grateful for the sense of touch, that we're able to touch other people and be touched on many, many levels. Let's take a deep breath and let go. And let's just sit in silence for a moment. Take a deep breath and let go. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And maybe as a sweet way to close, if you could just write in the chat, and if you want to stay quiet, that's fine too. If you want to just write in the chat, maybe what you're taking away from it, and think of it as maybe just a word or a line from a poem or a song that you'd like to create. So just put a phrase in the chat, and as you guys write, I'll read it out, and then we will say good night.
How do you save the chat?
I'll give you about 30 seconds before I start reading. Oh, this is looking beautiful. Okay, I'll start reading. Let's think of it as a poem. Cheryl, you got the title, baby. Celebrating vindication, restoring. Thank you, so inspiring. The possibility is infinite. If we look in and look out with open eyes and move together, continue to not be hidden from society. Grateful for people like you, all who care. Love to you all. We are one. Incredible information of prime source. Peace, focus, change. Thank you for this wonderful discussion, so concise but so informative. I was most struck with connection is the curriculum. Peace and blessings. That's a good way to say goodnight. Thank you guys. We're doing it every Thursday. Nice to see you, Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
We'll come together next week with an amazing teacher live from India, Bawa. If you don't know him, he is a remarkable, remarkable educator who will help us really look at our brain and our sleep in a brand new way. So I highly encourage you to check it out. It'll be earlier in the day, 12:30 EST. But for the moment, a big final shout out and thank you to Mr. V. Thank you for your courage, your vulnerability, your wisdom, and your dedication in all you do. Your inspiration for all of us, and we appreciate the gift tonight.
Thank you for staying, Miss Wade. I'm glad you stayed, Miss Wade.
Thanks, everyone. Been an honor. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Good night, Cheryl.
Excellent job.
Excellent. Night, Arlene.
Night. Good to see you. So
Night,
good.
Arlene.
Bye.
Hi, Arlene. Good to see you, Cheryl. So good to see you.
It was great, Elon.